Once she signs, it's all ours. I didn't hear the beginning of the conversation. Just that sentence. And somehow it was enough. I was standing outside the kitchen door, close enough to recognize my mom's voice instantly, and far enough that she didn't know I was there. Mark spoke next, quieter. You're sure she won't notice? A small pause. Then my mom exhaled softly, almost amused. She won't. Not she might not. Not we'll handle it. She won't. That kind of certainty doesn't come from guessing. Comes from planning. I didn't move. Not because I was scared, but because something in me needed to hear more. Needed to understand what exactly they thought I wouldn't notice. Because they weren't talking about something small. You don't say it's all ours about something small. And then she said it. Tomorrow is important. We just need her to sign without overthinking. Tomorrow. That word stayed longer than the rest. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just final. I stepped back slowly, careful not to make a sound. The floor in our hallway had always been tricky, but I knew exactly where not to step. I'd learned that years ago. Some habits don't come from curiosity. They come from needing to know things without being seen. By the time I reached the stairs, my expression had already settled. Calm. Normal. Like nothing had shifted inside me. But something had. Upstairs, my room felt too quiet. Everything was where it should be. The bed, the desk, the shelf near the window. Even the small wooden box sitting in the corner looked untouched. I didn't go near it. Instead, I sat down slowly and let the silence stretch. Because the more I replayed her words, the less they felt sudden. She won't notice. That wasn't confidence. That was experience. And that's when something else started to settle in. This wasn't a plan they came up with today. This wasn't even new. I just hadn't seen it yet. Not clearly. But if you listen long enough, things start connecting on their own. The small conversations that stopped when I entered a room. The way my mom had been unusually calm this entire week. The way Mark suddenly started showing interest in things he never cared about before. At the time, none of it felt important. Now it did. But the strangest part wasn't what they said. It was how normal it sounded. Like they had already practiced it. Like this wasn't the first time they talked about me that way. And maybe it wasn't. I leaned back slowly, staring at the ceiling, letting the pieces sit where they were without forcing them together. Because rushing this would be a mistake. And for the first time, I wasn't the one being unprepared. They thought tomorrow was the moment everything would go their way. They just didn't realize. I had already started paying attention. The next morning didn't feel different. That was the first thing that bothered me. No tension. No awkward silence. No sign that anything important was supposed to happen. My mom was already in the kitchen when I walked in, moving like she always did, calm, precise, like every step had already been decided before she took it. Morning, she said without looking up. Normal. Too normal. Mark was sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone, like he hadn't been part of a conversation that quietly changed everything the night before. I poured myself coffee slowly, giving them time to act differently. They didn't. And that's when I understood something else. Whatever they were planning, it didn't feel risky to them. Felt routine. Big day today, my mom added casually, placing a folder on the table like it didn't matter. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, I sat down across from her, letting a small silence stretch between us. Not uncomfortable, just enough to see if she would fill it. She didn't. She just smiled slightly. You trust me, right? There it was. Not an explanation. Not context. Just a question that wasn't really a question. I met her eyes for a second, then nodded. Of course. The word came out easily. Too easily. And for a moment I wondered how many times I had said it before without thinking. She relaxed slightly, like that one answer confirmed something for her. She won't notice. The words echoed again in my head. And I almost smiled. Because she was right about one thing. I hadn't noticed before. But now? Now I was paying attention to everything. She slid the folder a little closer to me. It's just some paperwork. We've been meaning to organize a few things. Just some paperwork. I rested my hand on the edge of the table, close enough to reach it, but not close enough to commit. Do I need to sign it now? I asked, keeping my tone light. Not right this second, she said quickly. We can go over it later. Too quick. Like she didn't want me to open it here. In front of her. That was the first real crack. Small. But clear. As if it was nothing, why wait? I leaned back slightly, nodding again like everything made sense. Yeah, later is fine. And just like that, the moment passed. Or at least that's what they thought. The rest of breakfast moved like nothing had shifted. Small talk. Half-finished sentences. The kind of conversation people use when they're trying to keep things steady. But underneath it, something else was building. Something quiet. Something patient. Because the truth is, I didn't need to open the folder yet. Not when I already knew it mattered. And not when they were still acting like I didn't. But what they didn't realize was, the moment you stop asking questions out loud, is usually when you start finding the real answers. I didn't open the folder that day. Not because I wasn't curious. Because I was. But curiosity makes people rush. And rushing is exactly what they were counting on. Instead I waited. And when people think you're not reacting, they get comfortable. That's when they start making mistakes. The folder stayed on the table all morning. My mom passed by it twice, each time just slightly adjusting its position, like she was reminding herself it was there. Or maybe reminding me. Mark barely looked at it. But that didn't mean anything. People like him don't need to look, they just wait for things to fall into place. Don't forget, we'll go through it later, she said before leaving the room. Later. That word again. I nodded without answering, because by then I had already decided something. I wasn't going to open it in front of them. Not when they were expecting it. Not when they were watching. The opportunity came in the afternoon. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that feels temporary, like it's waiting for something to interrupt it. I walked back into the kitchen slowly, my eyes going straight to the table. The folder was still there. Unmoved. Untouched. Waiting. For a second I just stood there, staring at it, because once I opened it, there was no going back to not knowing. And somehow that mattered more than I expected. But that hesitation didn't last long. I pulled out the chair, sat down, and slid the folder toward me. Slowly. Carefully. Like it might react if I moved too fast. And for a moment I didn't open it. I just rested my hand on top of it, feeling the weight of something I still didn't fully understand. Because the truth is, I already knew this wasn't just paperwork. I just didn't know how bad it was yet. And something told me, once I did, nothing in this house would feel the same again. The first page didn't look suspicious. That's what made it worse. Clean formatting. Legal language. A few familiar words placed just enough to make everything feel normal. Ownership. Authorization. Transfer. Words that don't mean much. Until they're placed in the right order. I kept reading. Slowly. Not because it was hard to understand, but because I didn't want to miss anything they thought I would. And that's when I noticed it. Not at the top. Not even in the middle. Near the bottom of the second page. A clause that didn't match the rest. Small. Easy to skip. But it changed everything. I read it again. Then a third time. Just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. I wasn't. The wording was careful. Almost polite. Like it didn't want to draw attention to itself. But what it actually did wasn't small at all. I leaned back slightly, the paper still in my hands, my eyes fixed on that one section. Because now something else made sense. The confidence. The calm tone. She won't notice. They weren't guessing. They were relying on something. Something subtle. Something easy to overlook. And suddenly the entire situation shifted. This wasn't about convincing me. It was about guiding me. Quietly. Carefully. Until I did exactly what they needed, without realizing what I was giving away. I closed the folder slowly. Not because I was done. Because I had seen enough for now. And the strange thing was, I wasn't angry. Not yet. Because anger makes people react. And reacting is exactly what they were expecting. Instead, I just sat there in the silence, letting the realization settle into something sharper. Something clearer. Because now I understood something they didn't. This wasn't going to happen the way they planned. Not anymore. But I still hadn't figured out one thing. How long they had been setting this up without me noticing. Once you see one detail, the rest don't stay hidden for long. That's the part no one tells you. You don't suddenly discover everything. You just start noticing more. And more. And more. By evening, I wasn't looking at the folder anymore. I was looking at everything else. The way my mom avoided direct explanations. The way Mark spoke less when I was around but watched more. The way certain conversations stopped the second I walked in. First it felt like coincidence. Now it felt intentional. I didn't bring it up. Not a single question. Because questions give people time to prepare answers. And I didn't want answers. I wanted the truth. Unfiltered. Unprepared. So I waited. Dinner came and went like any other night. Casual conversation. Small updates. Nothing that would stand out unless you were paying attention. And I was. Every pause. Every glance. Every word that didn't quite land right. But the most interesting part? They weren't nervous. Not even a little. Which meant one thing. They still thought I hadn't seen it. And that gave me something I didn't have before. Time. Because the longer they believed that, the more they would reveal without realizing it. And I didn't need to rush. Not anymore. Because whatever they were planning was already starting to show itself. Just not in the way they expected. Patterns don't announce themselves. They repeat quietly until you can't ignore them anymore. The next day, nothing looked different, but everything felt rehearsed. My mom didn't mention the folder again. Not once. Which somehow made it more important than if she had. Because people don't ignore things they need. They wait for the right moment. And that meant she was waiting for me. Did you get a chance to look at it? She asked later that afternoon like it had just crossed her mind. Casual. Too casual. I glanced up from my phone, keeping my expression neutral. Not really. I'll check it tonight. A small nod. Nothing more. But I saw it, the way her shoulders relaxed just slightly. Like delay didn't worry her. Like she knew how this would end anyway. And that was the part that didn't sit right. Because confidence like that doesn't come from hope. Comes from control. I went back to my room and closed the door quietly. Not because I needed privacy. Because I needed to think. The folder wasn't the problem anymore. The clause wasn't the problem either. It was everything around it. The timing. The pressure. The way they kept circling back to one thing without saying it directly. Sign. That was the only part that mattered to them. Not understanding. Not discussing. Just signing. I sat at my desk, staring at nothing for a moment longer than necessary. Because the more I thought about it, the less this felt like a one-time decision. Felt like a setup. And setups don't happen overnight. Which meant, this had been building long before I noticed it. And if that's the case, then I probably wasn't the only one involved. That thought stayed longer than I expected. Because if I wasn't the only piece in this, then I wasn't seeing the full picture yet. And something told me, the part they were hiding wasn't in the folder at all. It's strange how fast trust changes once you start looking at it differently. Nothing they said was new. But now everything sounded placed. Measured. Like every word had a purpose I hadn't noticed before. That evening my mom knocked on my door. Not unusual. But she didn't wait for me to answer before stepping in. I was thinking we could go over the documents together tonight, she said, standing just inside the room. Together. That word almost made me smile. Because if this was something simple, why make it a shared moment? I can look at it myself, I said calmly. Another pause. Small. But there. It's better if I explain a few things, she replied. Of course it is. Because explanations guide attention. And attention is easy to control when someone else decides where it goes. I nodded slowly. Sure. Later. She studied my face for a second longer than usual. Not suspicious. Just checking. Then she left. And that's when it became clear. They didn't just want my signature. They wanted control over how I got there. And that changed everything. Because the moment someone tries to control the process, it means the outcome doesn't survive questions. I leaned back in my chair, letting that settle. Because this wasn't just about what was written. It was about what they didn't want me to notice. And the more I thought about it, the more one question kept coming back. Why the rush? Why now? Because if this had been planned for a while, then something must have changed recently. something that made timing important. And I had a feeling that answer was a lot bigger than anything inside that folder. And if you're still following this, just stay with me, because what I realized next didn't just explain the timing. It exposed everything they thought I'd never figure out. The answer wasn't in what they said. It was in what they avoided. I didn't look at the folder that night. Instead, I looked at something else. Something I hadn't thought about in a while. Old documents. Things that existed before Mark. Before the we became part of every decision. It took longer than I expected to find them. But when I did, everything started to shift. Because the numbers didn't match. Not exactly. Not obviously. Just enough to feel off. And once you notice something like that, you don't stop. You compare. You read again. You look for patterns. And that's when it hit me. Not all at once, but clearly enough that I couldn't ignore it. The clause in the folder wasn't new. It was built on something older. Something already in place. Something I had never questioned before. I sat there for a long time, staring at the papers in front of me. Because now the situation wasn't just uncomfortable. It was intentional. Every step, every conversation, every casual suggestion, leading here. And suddenly, her words from the night before didn't feel distant anymore. Once she signs, it's all ours. Not will be. Is. Like the outcome was already decided. Which meant, this wasn't about gaining control. It was about finalizing it. And that realization changed everything. Because if they already had part of it, then I had been giving it away slowly without even realizing it. And that's when I understood the real problem. It wasn't tomorrow. Tomorrow was just the last step. The real damage had already started, long before I ever stood outside that door. And that's when I stopped wondering if I was being manipulated, and started asking how much they had already taken. Once you see the full pattern, you can't unsee it. And the moment it becomes clear, everything else falls into place. The folder, the timing, the pressure. It wasn't random. It was structured. Built carefully over time, piece by piece, until the final step looked harmless. Until signing felt normal. Expected. Easy. She won't notice. Now I understood why she said that. Because I hadn't noticed. Not when it started. Not when it slowly shifted. Not when small decisions became permanent ones. But now? Now I saw all of it. And the strangest part was, I wasn't panicking. I wasn't angry. I was calm. Because for the first time, I knew exactly where I stood. And more importantly, where they thought I stood. That was the advantage. They believed I was still the same person. The one who trusted without checking. The one who signed without questioning. And that belief was about to cost them everything. Because they were waiting for tomorrow. But I wasn't. I leaned back slowly, closing the documents in front of me, letting a quiet certainty settle in. Because now the situation wasn't unclear anymore. It was simple. They had a plan. They thought it was finished. And they were absolutely sure I would follow it. But they made one mistake. They assumed I would react the way I always had. And that's the part they didn't prepare for. Because the moment you stop reacting the way people expect, is the moment their entire plan starts to fall apart. The strange thing about control is, you don't need to take it. You just need to stop giving it away. The next morning, everything played out exactly how they expected. Breakfast. Silence. That same careful normal. My mom placed the folder on the table again, this time a little closer to me. Not pushing. Just positioning. Let's go through it now, she said. Not a question. I nodded. Calm. Agreeable. Exactly what they were expecting. And for the first time, I opened the folder in front of her. Slowly. Carefully. Like I hadn't already read every word inside it. She started explaining immediately, pointing at sections, skipping others, guiding, controlling. This part just makes things easier long-term, she said lightly. Of course it does. Easier for who? I followed along, nodding at the right moments, asking just enough to seem engaged, but not enough to disrupt the flow. Because disrupting the flow would raise questions. And I didn't want questions. Not yet. Mark watched quietly from across the table. Not involved but not absent either. Waiting. That's all he needed to do. Wait. And for a moment I almost admired it. The patience. The confidence. The assumption that this was already done. But that assumption was the only thing holding their plan together. And assumptions are fragile. I reached the last page. The signature line. Blank. Waiting. My mom slid a pen toward me. Just sign here. Simple. Clean. Final. Picked up the pen. Paused. Not long enough to worry them. Just enough to feel real. Because moments like this matter. Not for what they are, but for what they look like. And right now this looked exactly like what they wanted. I lowered the pen toward the paper. And stopped. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Because the truth is, this wasn't the moment they thought it was. It was just the moment they thought they had already won. I have one question. It was a simple sentence. But it changed the entire room. My mom didn't react immediately. She smiled first. Like questions were expected. Like this was still under control. Of course, she said. I looked down at the paper, not at her. Why does this clause give full control after signing? Silence. Not long. But long enough. And that's all I needed. Because hesitation doesn't lie. It's just a formality, she replied a little too smoothly. Everything stays the same. I nodded slowly. Like I was considering it. Like I believed her. But something had already shifted. Because now she knew I had read it. Not just seen it. Understood it. And that changed the balance. Slightly. But enough. Mark leaned forward just a little. It's standard. Nothing unusual. Standard. That word again. Used when something needs to sound normal. I set the pen down gently. Not rejecting. Not agreeing. Just placing it there. And for the first time, neither of them spoke. Because the script had changed. And they didn't know their lines anymore. I leaned back slightly, meeting my mom's eyes. Calm. Steady. You should have told me, I said quietly. Not accusing. Not emotional. Just honest. And somehow that made it worse. Because honesty leaves no room to hide. Her expression didn't break. But it tightened. Just enough. We are telling you, she replied. No. They weren't. They were guiding. Directing. Waiting for me to follow. But that part was over now. And if you've made it this far, you already know this isn't where things fall apart. It's where they finally realize they already have. The truth doesn't always explode. Sometimes it settles quietly and changes everything without warning. I already spoke to someone, I said. That was it. No details. No explanation. Just enough. And it landed exactly how I expected. Mark sat back immediately. Not relaxed. Alert. My mom didn't move. But her eyes changed. Slightly. Careful. About what? She asked. I looked at the folder again. Then back at her. Everything. Another silence. This one heavier. Because now it wasn't about control anymore. It was about uncertainty. And uncertainty doesn't belong in plans like theirs. I just wanted to understand what I was signing, I added calmly. Which was true. Just not in the way they thought. My mom folded her hands together slowly. Thinking. Adjusting. Because now she had to. Because whatever version of me she expected was no longer sitting in front of her. And that realization was just beginning to settle in. You don't need to complicate this, she said finally. Complicate. Another interesting word. Used when someone wants things to stay simple. For themselves. I nodded slightly. Exactly. And for the first time, she didn't have a response ready. Because the situation had changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But completely. And the plan they thought was finished was now something they couldn't control anymore. They didn't argue. That was the part one didn't expect. No raised voices. No confrontation. Just silence. And silence in moments like this says more than anything else. Because if they could have fixed it quickly, they would have. But they couldn't. Which meant the situation had already moved past them. I think we should take some time, my mom said eventually. Careful. Measured. Like she was trying to regain something she had already lost. I nodded. Agreeing again. But this time it meant something different. Because now, time wasn't working in their favor. It was working in mine. I stood up slowly, closing the folder and leaving it on the table, exactly where she had placed it. But now it didn't feel like theirs anymore. It felt neutral, unclaimed, uncertain. And that uncertainty was the only thing they couldn't control. I walked away without saying anything else, because there was nothing left to say. Not yet. And as I reached the hallway, I heard something behind me. Not words, just movement. The kind that happens when people realize they need to rethink everything. But by then, it was already too late for that, because they weren't adjusting a plan anymore. They were reacting to a situation they didn't understand. And if you've been following this carefully, then you already know. That's exactly where I needed them to be. They never asked me to sign again. Not directly. And that told me everything. Because people only stop pushing when they know pushing won't work anymore. The house felt different after that. Not tense. Just quiet in a different way. Careful. Measured. Like every word had to be chosen again. And maybe that was the biggest change. Not what I said, but what I didn't. Because I didn't confront them. I didn't argue. I didn't expose everything all at once. I just stopped being predictable. And that was enough. The truth is, they didn't lose everything in one moment. They lost it slowly, the same way they tried to take it from me. Quietly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to control. And me? I didn't win by fighting. I won by paying attention, by noticing the things they thought I wouldn't, by asking questions they weren't prepared for. And most importantly, by not becoming the version of me they needed. Because the moment I changed that, their entire plan stopped working. And if there's one thing I learned from all of this, it's that control doesn't disappear. It just shifts. And sometimes, all it takes is one moment of awareness to take it back completely.